2011 Minnesota Vikings. This is the team preview. We're going to talk about win totals, how to bet this team this year. I'm joined by Johnny Detroit. I'm Marco D'Angelo. Johnny, the last 2 years, I'm literally sick and tired of talking about the Minnesota Vikings. It was like every week we were talking about the Vikings because of the drama, the drama queen, the diva, whatever, adjective, adverb you want to throw at him. Brett Favre was there. It was just, forget about it. He's gone. Done. Right off into the sunset.
I even go back further. I've been tired of Minnesota since Super Tecmo Bowl because when I used the Detroit Lions and I played the Minnesota Vikings, the damn computer would cheat in that second game that I had to play them in the regular season, and their guys would catch every damn pass. So I've had a vendetta since the Minnesota Vikings because they did this like behind the thing option to Anthony Carter, and he would run like 100 yards blinking, and you couldn't tackle him. So my drama goes back, back to Super Tecmo Bowl.
I'm sorry to bring up old wounds.
Yeah.
Okay. But let's talk about the 2011 Minnesota Vikings after all that. Here's a team I think is going to fly under the radar. They were such a high-profile team, like we said, for the last 2 years because of Brett Favre. When we talk about it, it doesn't matter what sport it is. There's teams that there's no value simply because the public is so locked on to everything going on, public perception. And now the public perception is this team is falling down. Brett Favre is retired. They got rid of Brad Childress as the coach. Got a new coach. Leslie Frazier, this is his first head coaching job in the NFL. But he at least got the advantage of coaching the final 6 games last year. That's something that I've said going into this year, new coaches are going to be behind the 8 ball because they haven't had the normal process to lead up to the season. They didn't have their mini camps, in the spring. They didn't have optional practices at different times that players could come in and new players can get their hands on the playbook and everything else. But the fact that he did coach the last 6 games gives him a leg up that the guys that were here last year already have an idea of what to expect. And I'm looking at this and people are saying Donovan McNabb, he was done in Philly. He didn't do anything in Washington. This is a quarterback that, for all those years in Philadelphia, led this team to the playoffs year in and year out. They just could not win the big game, get to the Super Bowl or win the Super Bowl. And for that, he was chastised that, he wasn't good. This was a quality quarterback. Is he at the backside of his career? Absolutely. There's no question about that. Does he have to be at his best to make this team win? Brett Favre was at the backside of his career, and let's remember, forget last year, go back just 2 years ago, this team was 1 interception away from going to the Super Bowl. They went into New Orleans, into the Superdome, and almost beat the Saints the year they went on to win the Super Bowl.
And the thing is even if, losing for the season would be one thing, or if he comes out and he's, a bust, like you said, it's because the age is one thing. But even if he, misses a game or two and they got to put, the kid from Florida State Ponder in, I read that, he was in Florida training with these guys, the team. He's gung-ho. He got a playbook already, early on. He was setting up with a lot of the guys, and they were running patterns and running plays. So he's not going to be deer in the headlights, maybe because it's the NFL. But, he went to a high-profile university, where he was in the draft. And, he's already been playing with NFL stars using the playbook that they're going to be using in the regular season. So for him, for a backup, isn't necessarily a bad thing if he has to come in for a game or two,
Going back to Donovan McNabb, now, I listen to a lot of talk shows and sports blogs and everything else because, right now, and it's the beauty of the internet. You can just gather so much information, the beat writers for all these teams. And a lot of, and I heard it more than once, Donovan McNabb just never got it in Washington. One, he was signed late last year. He was a late free agent signing, so he had to come in, get the playbook late. Shanahan's offense is a little more complex than your average offense. He's been an offensive-minded coach his whole career, so there's more, the verbiage was totally different than anything he had been familiar with before, and that's where some of the problems came out. If you remember when they benched McNabb, the one game Shanahan, it was kind of unfair to roll McNabb under the bus the way he did, but there was a game that he pulled him when it was a less than a touchdown game, and it was, the final 2 minutes, that final drive, and he pulled him because he actually said the backup grasped the offense better to run the 2-minute offense. So that confirms what these beat writers have been saying. Now he goes to Minnesota. It's not as complex of an offense. It's a little more similar to what he was used to in Philadelphia. And there's one major, major difference in Minnesota that he didn't have at Washington. He's got a great defense in Minnesota to start with.
Mm-hmm.
Minnesota defense, you can't fault what they've done the last couple of years, and they got better last year. He's got Adrian Peterson in the backfield. That, I've said it 100 times on podcast videos. You take an average quarterback and you give him a great running game, it's going to make that quarterback, an average one, a good one. A good quarterback, it'll make him great. You have that running ability to take that pressure off McNabb. Then when McNabb, throws play action and everything else, everything's going to work a lot better. McNabb does not have to be the man for this Minnesota Viking team to win. All he has to do is not be a train wreck. Just manage the team, drive them, hand it off, pass when they need to pass. I think this team, the public perception is low on them. Vegas has set the total low on them. I like the Vikings. They've got the win total at 7. Here's a team that last year, as bad as everything was 6-10, but down the stretch, the final 6 games under Leslie Frazier, they were a 500 ball club, 3-3. I think they get to 8-8 this year, and I'm going to take them over the 7.
I actually agree with you 100% for a few reasons. Is one, even if you look at the regular season win totals, there's a handful of that have moved half a point, half a game, I guess you could say. Most of the time they just weight the juice. Minnesota opened at 6.5 over at -120, and now it's sitting at 7, where a lot of times if the book would move it from 6.5 to 7, they'd kind of reverse the juice.
Make it a flat.
Yeah, but it actually is now over 7 -125. And, not to say it's all sharp money, but are there that many people in Minnesota or Minnesota Viking fans that are betting that much money for the sports books to not only move it a full half a game higher, but to still weight the game on the over? Mm-hmm. I'm under the assumption there has to be some people who are betting this that the books are respecting taking Minnesota, because you're not going to see that big of a jump on a team like Minnesota. And another interesting thing, and this doesn't, totally make my case, but I like to look at as many variables as possible and kind of do like the T-chart and say, okay, I got 70 reasons on this time, side 20 on here, to kind of help me decide what I'm going to do, is to win the NFC Championship. The Giants opened at 10-1, they're sitting at 9-1. The Vikings opened up at a whopping 18-1, they're down to 10-1. So essentially what the Giants are, regular season wins, the Giants are at 9.5. They opened at 9.5, Minnesota at 6.5, now 7. So you have a team, Packers, you under the assumption they're going to win it. But for the tier 2 and 3 teams, you got a team like the Giants that they're laying 9-1, and they're essentially giving the same amount to Minnesota. But then the Giants are expected to win 2-3 more games than Minnesota. I just think that it's a plug-and-play situation there at Minnesota. There's too much public perception that, a lot of people didn't like the pick with Ponders. Was it Ponders, whatever, the kid from Florida State. I read good things about him. I heard he's gung-ho on the offense. The offensive players embraced the kid. They were down in Florida practicing the plays already. You got a veteran quarterback coming in to a system that's more him. You got a fan base that's going to want to win. I like the over also.
And if you look back at last year's schedule, even with, obviously Brett Favre was there, and Brett Favre had a lot of problems last year. Once again, he came into camp late because, I'm retiring, I'm not retiring, I'm retiring. They had to go down, beg him and, to come back and everything else. You look at the beginning of the season, they opened the season, that opening game, on the Thursday night game. They went to New Orleans in that big revenge game, and you got, New Orleans getting their Super Bowl rings and everything else. The hoopla of the new season. That's so tough to go on the road, that first Thursday night game. They almost beat New Orleans 14-9, and remember, Favre was only back in camp a few weeks. The next week they had the gut-wrenching loss to Minnesota, 14-10.
They played themselves?
They played Detroit, and then, excuse me, Miami. I'm sorry, I just got that. They played Miami. They lost 14-10.
I feel like RJ right there.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. Then they had the game against the Jets on Monday night. Now, the final score was 29-20, so it looks like it wasn't close. That game, they had the ball and were driving in a fourth, to win. They could have won the game, but a turnover turned around the other direction for a touchdown.
I remember that game.
I'm sure as you cringed, I can remember you probably had Minnesota. Yeah. So it made that score look bigger than it was, and it wasn't. So here's right there in the first 4 weeks of the season.
What was that line? It was like 3 or 3.5. Remember that?
I
remember I saw it on the TV, and I flipped out, and my wife, I remember she looked at me and said, "You can't say that in front of the kids." Yeah, they were +4, because I remember they had the ball, and they were covering, and I saw it, and I said, "Mom, you can't say that." I was like, "What? Like, you know what I just lost?"
So
pull the kids out of private school.
There's a situation. I just think that we're all about value, definitely, and I think the Minnesota Vikings at 7 wins. It absolutely screams value for me. So I'm going with Minnesota over 7 runs. But we're in the middle of baseball season. Over.
How much you had to drink today already? Yeah.
Not as much as I'm going to have to drink tonight, okay? So Minnesota over 7 wins. That's my second pick. That's going to wrap up this section of win totals for us. Earlier this year.
We're going into college football
We're
now.
going to college football, yes. Just throw out there, I did 2 win totals earlier. I did it the first week. They were my 2 best bets. Recap those. It was the Oakland Raiders under 7 wins and San Diego Chargers over 10 wins. I gave those out last week.
Pregame.tv if they want to watch the actual videos.
You can watch the videos, pregame.tv. That's why I keep you along, keep me straight. He's Johnny Detroit. I'm Marco D'Angelo. We'll be right back talking college football.